Well, today is Juneteenth, the federal holiday that commemorates the emancipation of slaves. And so I thought it would be a good day to discuss reparations. In the state of California, where I'm located, a task force was assigned with figuring out what reparations would be appropriate for the Black Americans in the state, which I should point out is not a slave state. And they came back with a proposal of giving each eligible Black Californian up to $1.2 million worth of payments. Now, this had many people outraged and even seeking to flee the state. Of course, not all reparations look like this. With us now is Greg Marcel Dixon. He's a teacher and a reparations activist from South Carolina. He's running for South Carolina's 6th U.S. Congressional District. Marcel, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Kim. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. And I know there's a slight delay, so we're going to work with this, with what we've got. We've got technology here
Okay.
going through this. But I want to start off first to paint the picture for people, to get them to see that you are a nuanced person. You're not, some people watching be like, oh, great, a guy all the way on the left. I just want to point out that, and we might get into this a little later, but you are currently suing the school that you teach at for racial discrimination and political retaliation, and you've added James Clyburn and his daughter, of all people, to the lawsuit. So you are suing them, and you say that mysteriously, quote unquote mysteriously, the case was then reassigned to a judge who was a Clyburn donor who was recommended to the federal bench by Clyburn, has been assigned the lawsuit, and Clyburn's lawyer hired a guy who was a former law clerk for the judge, who is a Clyburn donor, and this is the swamp. So you even call out people on the left. So I just wanted to paint that picture first before we get into this conversation. So let's talk reparations. Now, California, as I mentioned, just said, okay, $1.2 million in payments for each individual who's a descendant of slavery. What are your thoughts on that amount? That's a lot of money. That's too much. To me, that's too much money. That's too much.
Well, first of all, let me say real quick that I am definitely not considered a guy on the left by people on the left. The Democratic Party absolutely hates me. And as my lawsuit alleged, that's why I feel the political retaliation was to deprive me of my constitutional right to exercise my freedom of speech. And like John Adams defended those British soldiers during the Boston Massacre, that old saying, I may not agree with what you say, but I will fight to death to defend your right to say it. That's how I want people to look at this case in which I'm currently experiencing. Because if this was a Republicans doing this to me, the Democrats would be screaming outrage. But these are allegations, but it is quite mysterious that as soon as I add Clyburn to my lawsuit based on allegations, it is mysteriously immediately reassigned to a judge who's a Clyburn's donor, and Clyburn has a lawyer, the Murdoch lawyer, Harpootlian, who hires the law clerk of the former law clerk of the judge. So I just want equality. If Republicans were doing this, the Democrats would be screaming bloody murder. So it should be the same outrage when the Democrats are giving at least a pretense of suspected impropriety. Now, to your question about California, I do want to make one correction. California may have been admitted as a free state, but prior to that, it did have slavery. And there are actually a bill of sales that shows that even after California was admitted to the Union as a quote unquote free state, there were still people enslaved because up until 10 years after California's admission to the Union, people were having to buy their freedom. And you could only truly buy your freedom if you were enslaved in the first place. And then, of course, California has fugitive slave laws, and they pretty much have black codes as well. In some cases, California's Fugitive Slave Law Act was worse than that of my native state of South Carolina, the state that was the capital of slavery. So I do want to say that. I want to also say that reparations, I agree. This whole country, yes, $1.5 million sounds like a lot of money, but when you think about the fact that Black Americans have been in America before its founding, but definitely helped founded America, and we've been paying taxes into state governments and federal governments for centuries, and we did not get equality on paper at least until the mid 1960s. Think about all the wealth we've been deprived of, and then you would even say even more so, that's a lot of money. So whatever we are given a reparations is simply what this nation owes that we didn't get from the taxes that we were paying into the system. And reparations truly is a federal responsibility. So while I support what's being done in California, ultimately the responsibility is on the federal government because states just don't have the revenue to truly pay reparations without possibly crippling their economy because state economies run off of taxes, not the case with the federal government.
Okay, so let's first start with so California came up with their idea, which is that 1.2 million, but that's not, when I talk to various people who are pro reparations, that's not all. A lot. There's a lot of different ideas. So, what specifically are your ideas of reparations? What would you like to see?
You know what, Kim? That's a good question, but let me say I'm not going to give you my idea because we live in a country that is based on laws and the Constitution. And the good news, Kim, America has already done the work with reparations for us. America has done reparations and they're doing it right now. Let me name a few groups. Native Americans. Okay, these are not the original Native Americans who were like, deprived of the land, as some would say. These are their descendants, or their great grands. And yet, right now as we speak, the Joe Biden, I call him Slow Joe Pro Biden, but I'll be respectful to your platform. The Joe Biden have done historic levels of funding for Native Americans. Native American tribes get a check from the government. They can spend it as they see fit. There are several Native American tribes that get so much money, no one has to work. We know Japanese Americans. I was 4 years old when Ronald Reagan, the fiscal conservative, all fiscal conservatives, signed reparations. And what did Ronald Reagan say? Ronald Reagan said if the federal government has caused the problem, the federal government has responsibility to repair the problem. And he signed reparations for Japanese Americans that was direct cash payments. Even though Americans helped stop the Holocaust. My great grandfather, who is a World War II veteran, he turned 99 a month ago. America was instrumental in making sure that Germany paid reparations to Holocaust survivors and their descendants, which they're still doing. People who were exposed to radiation during America's era of nuclear testing. Joe Biden just renewed the Radiation Compensation Exposure Act, and those people are getting checked. And if they're deceased, their surviving spouses or their children are getting checks. Back to the Japanese American, real quick. A lot of them were dead by the time 1988 came around, and when checks started to be distributed in 1992, some more died. It went to their children or possibly even their grandchildren. So the same standards should apply to Black Americans who have the longest proven history of government. This is not what an individual did. This is what the government did to a particular group. It should be direct cash payments. And people like to say, well, you weren't enslaved. Okay, well, a lot of those people aren't their great grandparents, but they've inherited houses from them. They've inherited money from those great grandparents. So if you can inherit wealth from your great grandparents and great great grandparents, then I have inherited the debt of mines. And America has already set a standard. Like Ronald Reagan said, if the government caused the problem, they have the responsibility to repair it. And it should be direct cash payments.
Okay, so I can somewhat get on board with that because you do point out some really good examples. But I think the big question about reparations for many of us comes down to who then gets the reparations. Because in the examples that you pointed out, like with the Japanese Americans, it was those that were interred and they had property taken from them at that time, so they were able to trace that. With the Native Americans, if you're Native American, a lot of that money goes to the tribe directly. So even if you're not living on the tribe, you may have some benefits, but maybe not as many as if you lived on the reservation. Um, so who do you think is eligible? Is it all Black Americans? Because as we know, there's a lot of Nigerian immigrants. There's a lot of people that were never they don't have any descendants of slaves. There's a lot of white people today who are actually descendants of slaves that now they look and
Right.
present completely white because their family, this white person was married and then another, and they married another. Like I'm half Asian. If I have a kid, my kid might be blonde and blue eyed. The next. So how are you? Who gets it?
First of all, Kim, thank you for even asking. So many people, all sides, left, right, middle, whatever, up, down, north, east, south, west. They just have these knee-jerk reactions instead of asking questions. Believe it or not, right now we are celebrating Juneteenth, and there's a issue with a lot of Black Americans who are descendants of American slaves, like myself, both sides, mother and father, all South Carolina coast, at least in the mid 1700s. Some people are making Juneteenth an African thing, putting the African continent on the Juneteenth symbol, and we find that offensive
Right,
because the truth of the matter is there were African civilizations that if they did not participate in the slave trade, it would never have happened. So
right,
why are you putting, in a sense, almost honoring people who participated in our enslavement? You might as well go ahead and put Europe on there too. So we find it offensive. So here's the thing with reparations. There's already a standard that exists. You mentioned it with the Japanese Americans. America cannot give you money because you are of a certain race. So America
right,
did not say, you Japanese, here's your check. It had
right.
to be Japanese Americans, as you already mentioned, who were interned or they are the descendants of a Japanese American who were interned. There were Japanese Americans who were living in America at the time of internment, but they were not put in those concentration camps. They didn't get a penny. So, likewise, the standard is if you are, first of all, Black American, meaning that's how you've identified and your parents have been identifying as such, and you are a descendant of American slave, you qualify for reparations because it is a fact that at the end of the Civil War, 90 to 95% of Black Americans were enslaved. And the smaller, much smaller, free people of color who were Black Americans who were free, most of them had escaped slavery or were once slaves and had emancipated themselves, but there was always the risk for them being sold into slavery. So Ann Coulter is a woman I probably don't agree with on most things, and she actually say things that deeply offend me, which she probably does on purpose. But one thing she does say, American immigrants, LGBTQ, I don't hate any of these groups. But a lot of groups come to America and say, like right now, we got people flooding the border. And they come over here and they have protesting in New York City saying, we deserve better accommodations, America. And Ann Coulter says, America doesn't owe you anything. Ann Coulter says, if America owes any group, honestly, it's Black Americans, even the Supreme Court. I don't agree with Justice Kavanaugh a lot. Justice Amy Barrett, I believe,
Coney Barrett.
Justice
Yeah,
Gorsuch. Yeah,
yeah.
Amy Coney Barrett. I don't agree with. I'm sure we don't see eye to eye, but even they said when deliberating affirmative action, they was like, if anyone deserves, to have benefits of affirmative action, it should be the descendants of the people who are actually wrong, not all these different groups. Same stand reparations. So it goes to Black Americans who are descendants of American slaves, who I refer to as freedmen. That's what we would call based on
Okay,
our
I
status.
oh okay. So the one point that I would point, I don't agree with it being must be Black Americans. How do you identify as Black? What do I identify as? I'm literally 50% white, 50% Asian. At what point am I no longer Asian? What is it, one drop black you're black? Do you have to actually look black? How black? How much pigment in your skin do you need to have in order to say, okay, I'm black and now and I'm also a descendant of slave? I mean, shouldn't it be if you can prove your lineage that you are a descendant of slavery, it doesn't matter if you are blonde and blue-eyed and the fairest person today, but you are owed that inheritance, as you mentioned. I mean, for me, for example, I have two full white siblings on my dad's side. I'm the only one that is half Asian. Could you imagine my outrage if I find out that only the white kids, the pure white kids, get the inheritance, but because I'm mixed, I don't, or vice versa? What if it turns out that my dad says, well, I'm going to give it to my minority child, the Asian one, and my two white kids get completely left out? We're all from the same father. So why shouldn't it then pass down based on lineage and not based on what you look like or how you present today? Because I don't even know how you go about deciding who is what.
I actually agree with you. It is absolutely based on lineage. However, slavery was based on two factors, not just you being Black, but you being enslaved. You see, the reparations claim begins with slavery. People sometimes call it slavery reparations. I despise that because after slavery ended, there was Jim Crow, there was redlining, sharecropping, lynch mobs,
Right.
FSA, destruction of Black neighborhoods, mass incarceration, war on drugs. So the debt began with the 4.5 million people who were freed from slavery and their descendants. At the time that happened, there were white people living then who had ancestry of people who were enslaved, but they were not the ones who were on the plantations. Some of them had their parents may have been enslaved, maybe their father raped a black woman, but they were therefore not having the experience of a person who was enslaved. But it does have to be a qualifier, like with Japanese Americans, you had to have been Japanese first and foremost, but you also had to have been interned. So with the reparations claim, it does require you to be a Black American, but obviously that's why you have to have an agency of the government who is going to help with vetting the claims. Because of course you don't want people who are old getting disqualified, but you also don't want people who discovered they had a great grandmother 1871, but they've been identifying as white and they have not had the lineage or experiences of a person who has inherited the wrongs that have been done to them. So that's where you have an agency that will vet those claims. But you make a good point. It ultimately comes down to lineage. It does not come down to race based, but a qualifier is you being a Black American and then a descendant of American slave at its genesis.
I'll tell you why that's not going to work. You're going to have in these southern states, you're going to have some white lady sitting there, and then the person has to show up and say, "I'm black and I'm a descendant of slaves," and then the person has to like check them out to are you really black? Because you can't do it on the form, right? You could if being a descendant's not enough, so they have to show up in person and be examined, and then the person looks at them and says, "I don't know, you've got green eyes, you're not black enough for me, so I don't
No.
have to give you anything." And then they decide, "I don't owe you any money because you're not black enough." And they might say, "Look, Marcel, you just don't look dark enough. I'm sorry." And then you say, "Look at me, I'm obviously black." And they say, "Not to me. You don't look black to me." I mean, if you leave it up to somebody's subjective, you're like that's ripe for issues.
That's why it doesn't go that way. It goes by in America, we do identify by race. I'm sure you've done applications where it's been for a job, an apartment, census, home loan, and you
Sure.
have to identify by race. So black, and it's not just black, it can be America has had different classifications, as you know, for race throughout the years. Colored, Negro, black, mulatto. There may even be a possibility of someone choosing other. So it goes by how you have been self-identifying for your entire life. But what we can have a person do is all of a sudden what happened with Native Americans in the Dawes Rolls, where you
Right.
had people who were not Native American pay $5, say, "Well, I'm Native American now." We cannot have that reparations. And that is actually, I would be against reparations if we allowed that to happen, because that would just be a grift. Now, that would be the true thing that would hurt the nation if we just allow everyone to say, "Well, I'm black now and give me a check." No, it has to be people who have been self identifying as black. People say 12 years or more. I say for your entire life,
Yeah.
okay? And you are a descendant of American slaves. So it does not go by your physical appearance because there are many
Okay.
black people who can pass for white. That has always happened in America.
All right. So my other issue with this, because like I said, I'm open to the idea of reparations. It just has to make sense to me logically, and it's all gotta, I've got to feel like it's all going to play out correctly. My other issue with it is, okay, so let's say we start writing these checks. Now, 1.2 million, I'm never going to get on board with that. That's way too much. But I can, let's say we're going to write $100,000 checks to people or 10,000, whatever. Pick your number in your brain. So you write the checks. What happens to the future generations? Because so your mom and dad decide to blow their checks and you're not born yet. You're born 5 years from now. 5 years from now, you're still black. You're still having to live with the repercussions of all of these things that have happened in the past and still the black community trying to build. What happens to you? Do you get a check too? Your parents blew their checks. To me, it seems like it needs to be set up differently to where it's not like you get an individual, everybody gets an individual check, and then you have to decide for how long, at what generation do you halt that? It seems to me like the goal should be to reverse the damage somehow. So it should go to communities, building businesses. Like if you could start a bit, because another thing is if we just print money and it goes into the economy, we could end up with some serious inflation. So it's gotta go to productivity. It can't just go to here's consumer behavior. If you cut checks and then people use it to consume, you've got a real inflation problem. But if you use the money instead for productivity, you don't end up with an inflation problem. And then you can actually sell that idea. So you could say, look, I want the reparations are to build businesses, build communities that are productive. I think you'd make a better case and people get on board with that. You get Republicans on board with that. They like
Well,
businesses. They like to see productivity. What do you
Well,
think?
then let me say, if Republicans like to see productivity, then the best thing they can do is be signing and pushing for legislation for Black Americans to get our reparations checked. Because even when we came out of slavery and we could not read, could not write, we were building Black Wall Streets, not just the one in Oklahoma, but throughout this whole nation. The only reason a lot of those Black Wall Streets are not here anymore is because the government that a lot of Republicans represent, like Democrats, destroyed it. So Black Americans, our Black Wall Streets did not collapse because we weren't frugal or wise with our money. Even with the stimulus checks that were given out, this is data, and Republicans can vet this. Anyone can vet it. And study after study shows Black Americans started more new businesses than any other group in America with those stimulus checks. Our business is also the most likely to fail, however, because we don't have the wealth to buffer ourselves during those times when you're still developing a business. So let me say
Sure.
that. Number two, I could not agree with it going to communities because Republicans can't have it both ways. You can't say you're small government and then say let's do big government programs when it comes to Black Americans. If you're truly small government, the way you're pushing for parents to get the funding for their child for public schools, why can you trust parents with the funding for their children to go to school, but you don't trust Black Americans with money that we are owed? If you're going to trust one group, you have to trust the other. Number three, we have to follow precedent. These other groups don't want to ask Japanese Americans, well, how are you going to spend your money? Like, what if you don't do good and your kids are born and they're still in the bad straight? Good politicians should always be trying to provide for their people. So reparation is not the be all end all, but it's something we're owed. So whether I blow my money or not, that's on me. Once
Right.
you pay the reparations, the debt is paid. The future generation, that's up to me to provide for them. But we have a functioning government where we should be running for office and getting people in office to do good policy. And as far as the money going to communities, again, we know the history of the government with Black American projects going to our communities. Look at the ghettos today. A lot of those were community projects that the government sponsored. Black Americans, we can take care of ourselves. Give us what we are owed. And every time we've been left the hell alone, excuse me, and we've just been given what we owe and given our rights, we've done well. The only time we haven't done well is when the government has gotten too involved in our affairs to hurt us. And as far as inflation goes, that's a legitimate concern. I have some of my people tell me, "Oh, it's inflation, this country owes us." And I tell them, in my heart, I get where you're coming from, but I can't run for office and have that everyone else attitude. Right? This is going to be the largest debt America owes. And it's America's fault that this debt is this large. They should have paid it when slavery ended. So it's not our fault that America didn't do what they're supposed to do when they were supposed to do it. However,
Yeah.
my plan addresses that. Instead of everyone getting a check for $3 million, we get paid in bonds. And I'm not an economics major, but I've studied this in depth. Bonds is really a security. Okay. It's almost like America is saying, I owe you. And America pays us on interest and installments. So it's a small addition to the budget. That way you won't have massive inflation. There is no way you can give 50 something million people a check all at once and think you're going to have enough resources for them to consume without causing massive
Right.
inflation. Inflation is often used as an excuse by the government to not do things for people, but they don't mind raising their paychecks though. They don't mind bailing these corporations out. No one's worried about inflation then, but that is a legitimate concern. So it has to be paid out in installments and personal responsibility. The Republican Party is the party of personal responsibility. So I learned. If you believe in personal responsibility, then give Black Americans that same dignity. We survived in a country for 400 years that was trying to wipe us out. We know how to survive, and we'll do just fine with our money. You didn't ask these other groups if they won't do with theirs. Don't insult us and do it with us. Fair is fair. Republicans believe in that. Justice for all or justice for none.
Marcel, thank you so much for being here. We could debate this all day, and I would love to have you back to have
Thank
to
you.
further the conversation
Yes.
because I definitely think it's a good one. But marcelforcongress.com is how you can support his campaign. The
Thank
slogan
you.
is Repair Black America to Fix America. So that definitely you put out there what you're running on, and I really like that about you. So Marcel, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And until next time, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. You take care.
Well, many are worried that the dollar may be in trouble because the world is turning away from the U.S. and shoring themselves up to avoid sanctions and other economic fallout. We've seen OPEC countries banding together saying they don't only want to trade in dollars anymore. So this has many people worried about the future of their retirement accounts. And the fact is, there is one asset that has withstood economic upheaval and has a history of being incredibly stable, and that is gold. And you can own it in a tax-sheltered retirement account with the help of Birch Gold. That's right, Birch Gold will help you convert an existing IRA or 401k, maybe from a previous employer, into an IRA in gold. And the best part, you don't pay a penny out of pocket. So just visit birchgold.com/Kim for your free info kit. They're going to hold your hand through the whole process. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of happy customers. So visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit on gold. Again, visit birchgold.com/Kim.